Good morning, everyone. My name is Patrick Watkins. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of our panel and on behalf of the Heritage Conservation Council to this discussion. This is DIY or Hire, and our program and our panel is organized by the Lawrence Preservation Alliance. Their mission is to preserve historic buildings and environments, to educate the community about the benefits of preservation. Dennis Brown, the longtime president of the LPA, is here as well today. He played a large part in this. But welcome on behalf of those organizations. My name is Patrick Watkins. I'm an attorney. I practice in Lawrence, primarily in land use. Recently, I've had sort of a specialty in historic preservation tax credit law. I'm a board member with the LPA. I recently also started 2 historic tax credit residential renovations. But with us today is really an accomplished and dazzling set of experts and panelists. All 3 have experience in old home projects, and really the timeless question of, do you hire or do you do it yourself? So I'd like to introduce our panel, and if it tells you anything about these folks, they all gathered here this morning, saw some work that was taking place outside with Carl Ramberg, and sure enough, all 3 of them were swinging hammers for the last 20 minutes. These are the people that know how to get things done and do it well. We've got slides. I've got a couple of just introductory pictures. First panelist is Dorian Hieronymus. And by the way, I'll also say, if you drive through Lawrence at any point in time, North Lawrence or the historic districts, you're likely to cross projects that any one of these 3 people have taken part in that you've probably overseen. Dorian is the owner and operator of Fine Home Restoration in Lawrence. It offers interior and exterior remodeling, maintenance, and rehabilitation. He's done some remarkable projects in the Rhode Island Historic District. Next slide. You might recognize a couple of them. This one, Dorian shared some pictures with us. This is a great porch restoration project. Next slide. Another good example of Dorian's work. Next slide. This is Salon de Marco downtown. We're honored to have Dorian with us here today. Next slide. Landon Harness is the owner and operator of Form and Function, home building and contracting business in Lawrence. Landon and his team recently completed historic tax credit projects to Ernst & Sons Hardware Shop at 826 Mass and Spaces at 1021 Mass above Aladdin's Cafe. Next slide. You're likely to see some of Landon's projects in East Lawrence. He's got several of them. We drove down here today and he was explaining the number of projects that he's working on. This is a good example of a bathroom that he recently did. Next slide. He's also been, he does whole home construction, and he does whole home restoration. Next slide. Our third panelist is Billy Price. We can't find a picture of him, so we had to go track down one of his high school friends to share us a picture from high school. Yeah. He is the owner of Billy Construction, a business dedicated to designing and building a wide range of improvements, from decks and fences to whole home rehab and construction. Billy has a degree in mechanical engineering from KU. He worked for a time for KDOT. I'm lucky to say that I live in a house that Billy fully rehabilitated in East Lawrence. So I'm honored to be on stage with these three folks, and I'm excited to introduce some topics and let them explain their experiences. So our first section in this discussion, let's leave this slide of Billy up for a while. Our first section of this discussion provides question and answer from our panelists. So the first question is, and we'll start with Lynn and let him answer first since he's in the middle. But what advice would you give to someone taking on an old home project?
Oh, that's a good one. We've done a lot of, so my career is basically I bought a lot of houses that were condemned or foreclosed and flipped them when I started. And we mainly focus on big, $250,000 and up projects, so big whole house remodels. And when I talk to clients about their projects, I basically have to caution them that when you're starting with an old house, it's pretty much unknown until until you start removing the walls and you start finding out what the electrical and the plumbing and the actual structure looks like. We've seen houses that I'm not sure how they were still standing when we got to them. The framing was just kind of all over the place, and so the number one thing I tell any client getting into a old house restoration is make sure that whatever you want to spend, you have like 20 to 30% on top of that, because inevitably we find something that nobody even anticipated, whether it be a cistern that's 30 foot deep, or whether the plumbing's all rotten, or there's no headers and everything. So it's just it's totally an unknown when you deal with old home remodels or additions versus like when you start new construction. It's pretty much it's all kind of starting at ground level.
That's great. Dorian, do you have any pieces of advice that you would give to someone taking on an old home project, maybe building upon what Landon said?
Yes, I think that there's a danger we're going to repeat each other, because I think the same way. Just remember that remodeling is more expensive than new construction, and we still do it because we have a passion for older homes. My experience has been that often people will come to me and say, we just bought a house, we want you to come look at it. Instead of saying, we are planning to buy this house, will you come look at it? Because once I go look at it, a lot of times there's a lot more work that has to be done than they realized, and they didn't really know what they were getting into. And for example, there may be a lot of deterioration that's going to require being done it'll delay the elective things they wanted to do for a long time. And a lot of things are just prohibitively expensive. Also, I've had friends and clients bring me into a house and say, we want to do this and this and this and this. And eventually it's like, well, why didn't you just buy that house in the first place instead of completely changing this house? So that would be something to think about. And I agree with what my colleague said. It's that everything is going to take longer and be more expensive than you thought it would. So if you have either a friend or a contractor that you plan to bring in, have them come in before you buy the property.
Great advice. Billy, anything to add on these things?
Yeah, well, you just, you discover so much along the way. Like during a lot of people will try to either want to maybe try to be part of the demo themselves, because you either have to have less knowledge, I think, but you learn a lot during the whole demo, and so you'll discover all these things along the way that need to be repaired or should have been replaced last time it got remodeled, but now they're all getting dumped onto this remodel. And so from a professional standpoint, we want to do it right and have you happy at the end, so we're just going to keep trying to fix these things that we didn't know about along the way, so it does just take longer and get a little more expensive. So just be prepared for that and be patient to work with whoever you work with, especially these days. It seems a little slower.
Yeah, it seems like patience and costs are sort of reoccurring themes. If you want to learn about how to mitigate your costs on this, Mike Delaney is going to host a discussion later today about the tax credit program. So might be some solutions there. I'll offer up another question, sort of a similarly broad question, but is there anything special about your approach to starting an old home project? You all know old homes pretty well. And how would you start an old home project in a different way than you would start a new home project? What's your first steps, and how would you approach, say, your client in someone who has an old home project? The first few steps that might be different than a new home project. Billy, do you want to start with that?
Well, on an old home, I guess it depends on the design, how much you're adding. If you're doing like a whole addition, I mean, you're still going to have a good design going in, and that takes a long time. So if you're doing like a whole addition on an old house, you're going to have that designed before you ever get started, just like a new house, you know. If it's a bathroom remodel, you can kind of start tearing into it before you have architectural drawings or something, you know. But I guess that's the main thing. It's just the scale of the project, and maybe that's what people hire. You know, start with a small project if you're thinking to do it yourself, and then if you are doing something bigger, then you probably have to hire it or have someone help you design it along the way.
Landon, you've been in this space recently. You've got a number of new construction projects, and you also do whole home remodels. Which do you prefer right now? You know, in this space, and how do you sort of keep both those competing interests going at the same time?
Well, building a new house is 100 times easier than remodeling an old house. So my body definitely prefers that we do new homes. The old homes are way more fun. I mean, they are, you know, there's just a level of craftsmanship, which I think is why everybody in this room falls in love with old homes. There's a level of craftsmanship that, you know, is present in those homes that is nearly, you know, like there are a lot of great craftsmen today, but you don't see it replicated as much because of, you know, cost of material and times and just the world we live in. And so I think that's kind of the beauty of the older homes. And we've got to be in some amazing spaces in the course of my career. And, you know, Ernst & Sons in Lawrence was a time capsule. And we did, 3 of the properties for that family, and one that they had sold off, and one of them had been empty since I think it was like the 50s. It had been medical offices, and all the doors were still on there, and there were cobwebs, and no one had gone up there in 60 years. And so I really get a lot of joy out of that. When we take the approach, you know, with a new construction house, that's, you know, we're just doing it to the code, you know, like it's building walls, building roof, pouring slab. The older homes, for lack of a better word, is, you know, sometimes you have to reinvent the wheel to make the whatever project you're working on work. And so, like, above Aladdin Cafe, for example, which is downtown Lawrence, that's the space that had been empty for 50 years. It had like 5 separate floor joist systems in between the first floor and the second floor. It was like the floor was like that thick. And when you're trying to get plumbing and electrical and make it structurally sound, it's, you know, sometimes you're just calling the engineer and being like, how do we do this? I mean, like, what can we use in our tool book, you know, or tool bag to make this work? And sometimes it's thinking outside the box. And so the 2 projects, if we're going into an older home, you know, we're going into it with the understanding of, like, I always talk to my clients about what are we saving, you know, what's important here, you know, and so we can pull all the trim off, save all the doors, save the fireplaces, and it's just a totally different ballgame when you're new construction versus old. And I like them both equally. I don't know how keeping them separate sometimes. You know, it's been crazy. The last 3 years have been crazy in construction, just busy, and so it's definitely sometimes a challenge to keep all the projects moving forward and keeping all the clients happy at the same time.
Great. Dorian, do you have any lessons about starting a project? Maybe distinctions between projects, and anything to add on to what Billy and Landon started?
Yes, I think planning is everything. And when you plan, it's good to think about the fact that, because people often don't realize this until you're done with a certain part of the project, that the part you did is going to possibly make the part you didn't do look kind of shabby, even though it looked fine before you started. Also, towards the end of the job, the details start to mushroom. And you think, I mean, you see the job progressing and, oh, we're almost done, but the workload becomes more and more and more. So, and that goes back to what he said about how it's going to cost more, it's going to take longer. So try to plan for that.
It's fantastic. Here's a third question for you all, and this is sort of an anecdotal response, maybe something that you've learned on a particular project that still stays with you today. Is there a lesson that you've come across in your experiences that, however small it might be, or however particular it might be, it stays with you and you think about on every project you look at? Anything that comes to mind, Dorian, from your end, a lesson that you've learned during projects on old homes that follows you to this day?
Well, when I first started out, I worked in banking, I eventually worked in social work, and I kept coming back to the thing of, for example, when I worked in banking, it was just moving a lot of paper around, and I'm sure that what I did was important, but when I did remodeling, at the end of the day, I could see what I had done. And so I would say that anybody that gets involved in this as a homeowner or whatever, you can plan for enormous satisfaction from your work.
That's great. That's great. Anything to add on that, Landon or Billy?
Well, I agree that, yeah, it is just, doing it yourself is fun, just working on it. You know, that's why they have all these different, programs where people get to help out on community houses. It feels good to get out there and work on stuff and build stuff. And I think if you are considering to do something yourself, you should start on something, even if it's a small project, and then work your way up to a bigger one. But Dorian did mention the details on projects, and that is one note I had, that anytime you're doing a big remodel, toward the end, it's the details that just bury you. So you just have to stay organized with those, keep lots of lists. That's the main thing, lots of lists.
That last 10% of the job,
Uh-huh.
it's like it can take 50% of the job.
It does, and it kind of just gets bigger, so you just got to be ready for that,
Anything to add, Landon?
Oh, I forgot the question.
That's okay. Can you share a lesson you learned that follows you to this day? Maybe something on an early project, maybe something.
Oh man, we learn new lessons every day.
Yeah.
Every day it's like, how do we screw that one up? But like on the DIY to pro thing, I used to work with my dad all the time when I was growing up, and when I graduated college, I came up to Lawrence and I worked for the Boys and Girls Club in Lawrence and ran a program, and my parents were generous enough to give me, I think it was $40,000, and I bought a foreclosure in Lawrence in like 2009. And I did the whole thing myself, and I wanted to learn. I always wanted to do it, and none of the windows fit when I ordered them, because I didn't realize there was a difference between rough opening and like frame size, and so none of them worked. Some of my trim is pretty bad. Like I couldn't figure out how to cut crown, so I went and bought like the pre-molded corners from Crown from Home Depot, and they're still there. Because I still live in the same house, and like 10 years later, and we're building a new one this year, and I'm like, you look up there and you're like, oh man, I've come a long way. Like I think my stuff looks better now. But that's kind of like, anybody that wants to try a project, even when a client's like, don't mess with plumbing, don't mess with electrical, don't mess with your furnace. If it looks like it's structurally important, call somebody. But the rest of it is kind of just like, we all learn by doing. That's how I do. I learn by doing. Like I'm I've thrown away instructions more times than I could count because I didn't want to read them, and then I did it wrong, and then I went and found the instructions. And so that's my.
Yeah, that's great, thank you. So I've got another section of questioning, and these are meant to be short answers. I'll read a scenario, and you can respond with your initial interests or experiences. There are no wrong answers. There are embarrassing answers, and you might get some boos from the crowd. And then we'll open it up to any sort of questions you might have. We've got a panel of experts on old homes. If there's any questions from folks in the crowd, I think this is the time. But I've got 3 questions for you, and I'll call on you, but I'll read these scenarios. You've been tasked with refinishing a wood floor in downtown Lawrence. It's an oak floor, and it looks kind of modern, but you discover a layer of long-board yellow pine below the floor you're refinishing. It looks like it's in good shape, and the owner trusts your judgment, but says don't break the bank. You've got some options ahead of you. You've probably all been through this. What's your next step? What do you do? What do you think about? You see these old longboard yellow pines throughout Lawrence. DIY? What do you do? Anything to look out for on a decision like that? Start with Landon, because I know he's been through this.
Yeah, didn't we do this next to your dad's house?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, longboard pine is my favorite thing in the world. I think it's one reason we all like old houses. So I'm tearing up the oak, but then we're going to deal with what doesn't.
It may have been covered for a reason.
Yeah, it was covered for a reason. Yep.
Any other anecdotal or experience you'd like to share, Dorian or Billy?
I did this recently, and it's kind of out there, and you have to be careful, but it may be possible to find someone, because you don't want to break the bank, it may be possible to find somebody who will come in, who wants that oak floor, who will come in and take it out for the wood, so it doesn't cost, that part of the job doesn't cost anything. But you have to be sure that that's somebody that's not going to tear up pine that's below you.
Billy, you been through this before?
I probably would just try it. I don't know. That's a tough one because it just depends how it's nailed and what it's nailed with, how the top floor is put on. There's just maybe a small test section in the closet to check.
There you go. You're remodeling a back porch. You expose a portion of the ceiling boards to find a bat colony. You reattach the board without waking any of the bats or disturbing them. Who is the first person you call?
I was at Batman.
Anybody have a wildlife fix-it guy?
Wildcare or
Catching wildlife. Any interesting stories or experiences with wildlife dealing with old homes? I think that's what you get into with some of these old homes. Anything to share? I'll jump to the third question. You began a project to remodel an old home kitchen. One thing leads to another, and you've demoed half the house. When do you know when to stop? Any tips for our audience on stopping and starting projects, merging it with people? Go for it.
I was doing a restore on 1645 Louisiana, I believe. That's the Acker House, I think. And it's an Italianate, so it had this big crown molding, probably about that wide, going all around the top. And the client was complaining about squirrels getting into the attic, and there was a hole about that big around. So I put a metal patch over it and was real proud of my handiwork, and came in the next morning, and right next to it there was a hole about that big. So that was my experience.
When I think it was like year 2 when I was working construction, I was about 35 foot up on a gable end, replacing siding and vents. And I pulled off the vent cover and like 3 bats just straight by. And I was like, that's my bat story. Lucky to fall for that.
Yeah, one is enough.
There?
Yeah, call it professional. If there's a question.
No DIY on the wildlife.
Yeah, they can things can snowball out of control fast.
Any tips on when to stop a project and when to start a project? It's easy for these old home renovations to scale quickly. Anything that you would say about staying in one room? I think sometimes systems will prevent you from trying to remodel a portion of a house. Anything like that to share?
I think that's the hardest part about old homes
It
is,
is.
yeah, there's just, we've been down that road before where you start in one and you end up in another room because you're chasing problems. But yeah, it's a hard one. I think it takes a special breed of people to love older homes, and so that's. I think if you love the older homes, then you're well aware of the risk of owning them. And so sometimes you may start off with one little floor patch, and then you're in the next room over. And I think the important part is you just have to have, before you start anything, you got to have the resources, I think, to make sure you can finish it. So you don't end up with a house that's not done because you don't have the resources to finish it, I guess. That's the biggest thing.
Yeah, and it'd be really nice to think about just starting with one room and do that room, and then go on to the next room, and so on. But it's not really possible. Particularly, I mean, depending on how extensive your work is. Because particularly if you've got a permit, and you've got plumbing and wiring, you pretty much have to do that all through the house, which means that a lot of times you're gutting the entire interior. And I did that to my house, and I lived in it, and I could see the outside siding or the underlay, no insulation, no sheetrock, because you have to go through these various steps all through the project you have to do everything before you can do anything. So that's something to bear in mind.
Well, appreciate all the experiences and the information you shared. Is there any questions that anyone from the audience would like to offer up? I think we have a microphone. We've got a couple of hands raised. Great.
Test.
Make sure it works before I hand it to you.
Yeah, hi. This is a really helpful session. I'm really interested in it. Can you talk a little bit about foundations? I've seen a couple of really bad foundations recently, and how do you determine, sort of general scope of the work in terms of resources required and time required? I know it's kind of a broad question.
You're thinking about old home foundations, sometimes limestone
Yeah.
stone foundations.
Yeah, and with drainage issues and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think I can summarize that. How do you assess and sort of take into account and start a project that has foundation issues? What are the things to think about, and what are the things, how to approach a house with foundation issues?
Are we talking
Is that fair?
stone or concrete?
Stone.
Stone?
An old home.
When I first started my career, I wouldn't buy a house with a stone foundation, and as I've gotten farther along, I almost find stone foundations to be easier to repair than concrete because they're separate pieces. And so, one thing I tell every client is your stone foundation is, I will never put a guarantee that thing's gonna be watertight. When we get into them, like rebuilding them, like we're doing a house right now on 8th in Rhode Island that we had to rebuild large sections of the foundation. And so basically where we start, like, you'll see a loose rock up on the top, and we basically will chase that loose rock until the mortar is fine, right? And so that's about the only way I know how to do a stone foundation. But I find them to be easier than concrete foundations to repair. And the most, like, when they have a lot of lean-ins and things like that, and those really don't scare me. You can still fix them the same way you fix a concrete foundation by putting like deadment in or putting, like retaining walls on the inside. But it's just like every other thing with an old house. A good mason will be able to tell you, like, what portions of your wall are gonna need re-tuck pointed, and if it's just tuck pointed, it is, fixing a stone foundation is one of the cheaper things compared to like a new house where you have a larger piece of concrete, you gotta replace the whole thing. Tuck pointing is really one of the more affordable things. It's also one of the things, like if you're DIY, tuck pointing is something you can definitely do yourself. Like there's no real, there's a science to it, but there's professional, but it is something that you can do yourself for sure.
Well, I agree about this. Stone foundations can be a good, you can work on those yourself, more on like the mortar, tuck pointing the mortar and practicing that in an area, and then detail your whole outside and inside of your foundation. And that's a good place to start if you're going to do a remodel, to make the foundation or the roof secure before you polish the inside. So I think starting with the foundation is good.
We'll play that out.
I think the most important thing on the foundation before you even get to that stage is, and we haven't really talked about this yet, but make sure the water is going away from the house. That's I tell my clients, if I can get the water away from the house, I can increase the longevity. That's the most significant thing, and that's the thing that most often deteriorates a foundation. I guess that's preventative, but I recommend it.
I learned a timeless lesson on foundations recently. It took me like 6 months, but call Carl Rambert. That's the lesson. If you got a stone foundation, that guy can solve a lot. I know there's also a lot of lessons to be learned about historic foundations, historic masonry. There's mortar requirements, and those requirements that go along with historic preservation are intended to expand the life and do it properly. There's a lot of literature that the State Historical Society or offices will provide. There's preservation briefs about choosing the right type of mortar, because that makes a big difference. So something to keep in mind. Any other questions? Couple in the back.
Good. Carl's in the courtyard, so you can even ask him in person if you have questions.
You had a great segue. My question to you three is, have any of you worked on a property that was on the historical registry of places, either state or national? And then I'll have a follow-up question if yes.
I have personally, and I don't swing a lot of hammers, but I'm pretty familiar with them, and I know Landon has.
I have.
And Dorian, yeah.
Then the follow-up question is, what do you see as the pros and cons of that building or property being on the historical registry, state or national? Just kind of a curiosity question. Would you rather do work on a building that's not on the registry, or have the freedom to do work on one that's not? That's
Yeah, and there's a lot to think about there. I mean, one thing that I can lead off by saying is that it depends upon the project, right? But your historic registries come with requirements. In Lawrence, we have a number of districts, and you're required to follow a lot of the rules there. In my experience, one of the key benefit of being on a historic registry is that you have access to the historic tax credit. Oftentimes it costs more, and it takes more time to do these things through preservation, but that's what the tax credit's designed to help you support difficulties. But you all probably have some experiences with the historic register and working on properties like this. Anything to add to my initial comments?
We used to own 1015 Tennessee, which is the Blood House. It was owned by Colonel Blood, built by him. Yeah, I think he was the first mayor of Lawrence. We built an addition onto that and we had to do an enormous amount of work to find just the right materials, the soft brick, get the right shakes to match what was on, and that sort of thing. It's more expensive, but once again, my dad and I both had a passion for older homes. So, and the other part of your question, if we submit a permit in this town, think, I'm not sure, but I think it always goes before the historical people.
If you're within the district, certainly. And if you're in a historically designated property, it would have to go through design review. So you're going to be required.
My property, except for the little corner in the back, is in the environs. That's another designation, the environs of the historical. The train station over in North Lawrence creates this lozenge-shaped territory around it that you're in that, and then you have to conform to certain things. The historical people would not let me put on a metal roof on a garage I was going to build there unless I used fasteners that were not exposed. So it always creates more expense, but if you have a passion for that, then you accept that.
Yeah. One thing I would add is that a lot of times the historic review is focused primarily on the exterior of the home. You're allowed to do a lot more things with the interior of the home within limitations. But certainly, if you're in the environs, it's a bit of a burden because you don't also oftentimes get the tax credit associated with the registry. Anything to add, Billy or Lynn?
I think it's a good thing. Helps keep houses, people from putting up stuff that completely changes the way a neighborhood feels and everything like that. So I think it does good, even though it's harder to work inside those environments.
I would say, especially if you go on my website or follow like what my company does, I do a lot of modern stuff when I'm left to my own devices and build new houses, and so I've done a lot of historic stuff, and then if you look at some of my newer construction houses, they're pretty modern. And I think the historic designation is important because I think it's important we preserve our like our environments, our buildings, we preserve some of these neighborhoods that are intact. I also think sometimes as we talk about historic preservation, we forget that sometimes these newer architectural styles can add to the environment, add to the neighborhoods. And so that's I wouldn't say struggle, I would say that's the thing we kind of introduced. Like in Lawrence, for example, on 2114 Barker, I'm building my personal house, and then we saved the front of the cottage, we tore out the back addition, it's gonna have a wild, modern addition on the back. And some people are gonna love it, some people are gonna hate it. About a block away, we're building a custom home for some people that is a traditional 4-square with a modern floor plan. Half the people that come by think it's a remodel because it looks just like an old 4-square. And so I think those two things can exist in the same, and they're both in the environment of a beautiful brick, I don't know the name of the house, but it's, we basically sandwich it. And so I think all three of those things can exist in the same neighborhood and still add to the overall feeling and environment of the town, if that makes sense.
I think one of the key struggles is making sure that you know that you're in a designated property or in the environs before you get too far down the road. It sounds like you sort of want that.
If you don't know a lot of contractors, how would you recommend finding somebody that you are comfortable with and that you want to work with? Don't live in old West Lawrence, don't live in East Lawrence, live out in the country. How do you find somebody?
It's a great question.
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a good question.
And how do you find somebody that you can trust?
That's a good, yeah.
It takes time. I've been through this process, and it does get easier as you go. Any of you who have good advice for how you might find someone that...
You can just start asking around a lot. You can stop by projects, that you see going that look clean, look organized, seem to be making progress, talk with them.
Seem to be making progress, I like that.
Ask, friends, go to Home Depot, Menards, talk to contractors you see. Just start asking, interview people, and then get stuff in writing, That's the main thing.
Yeah, unfortunately there are some unscrupulous lots in the construction industry, and my number one thing I tell all clients is you never give all the money to the contractor before the project's done. Because we've all heard stories from clients that are like, well, they said it was $5,000 and they wanted all of it up front and they tore this wall and they disappeared. as far as finding a company, a lot of us, you know, my advertisement is purely, my trailers are painted with my name and my company, and I put yard signs in front of the projects we're working on. There are some bigger companies that advertise. The county's kind of tricky because a lot of guys don't like to work in the county for travel time, and but yeah, I don't. Yeah, that's my point.
It's a good question.
It's a great question.
One thing I would note is that if you have a preservation project or an old home project, the Lawrence Preservation Alliance has a section of their website dedicated to preferred contractors. That might be a good place to start as well.
Yeah, and any legit contractor will offer up previous clients' numbers to call for references.
Yeah, somebody call references.
Yeah. When we're doing big projects that are in the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, I encourage people to call because we each run our companies in a different way, and it's important that you get along with us because construction is a very stressful process. Coming out of working at Boys and Girls Club, I was like, oh man, working with people's kids, like that's, you know, people are stressed out with that. You go into people's houses and work in their houses, people are also stressed out about that. And so call previous, if they won't offer up previous clients or references and they want more than, you know, more than seems reasonable up front, then those are two red flags for me if I was hiring a contractor. Because if you're legit, you have nothing to hide. And you know, like, we don't ever take all the money until the last, until you sign off on it. Just so that we have a little incentive to come back.
Need to add, Dory?
Well, it's kind of an extension to your question, but I think we need to be aware that there aren't that many people going into this, and it's going to be a problem in the future. I'm trying to retire. I've got a business, and I can't find anybody to take it over. I'd like to find a young guy that wants to do it, but I can't find anybody. So that's going to be a problem that we're going to have to confront somehow in the future. When you do talk to somebody about working in your home, be real sure it's somebody you want in your home. Because, I mean, it's a real intimate situation. You're going to you can't be there all the time. Is it somebody that's going to respect your privacy and the sanctity of your home? And I was happy to say that I had a client who, I was in there for probably a month, and I got done, and then I talked to the client the following Monday and asked how she was doing. She said, well, fine, but we just miss having you here. And that meant a lot to me. I had another client in the same situation. We talked on the phone later, and she said, it's really nice not having people in the house every day. So I'm real sensitive to that too. I don't like to come home from work and find the guy that I've hired staying several more hours when I want to start my evening activities. But do make sure it's somebody you want in your home.
Great question. Any other questions we can answer?
In your experience before you start a project, how much are you like mitigating with like existing historical records? Like a lot of these buildings might not be listed, but they might have a long archival history. Are you kind of digging into that first, or just kind of seeing what's on the ground as is?
Sure. The question is, what sort of research, what sort of records do you look at before you start a project? Anything that you'd recommend in terms of understanding the history of the home, even if it's not designated?
To preserve the look of the house historically, or like is that the kind of research you're talking about? Like,
just in general, because obviously people have to live in them, but these buildings do kind of life of their own, and how do you kind of mitigate those two worlds that these buildings are existing in?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. I mean, that's one thing I've kind of learned talking to these folks early on is that before starting a project, it's about preparation. And the more you can learn about the project, the more realistic you can be about your estimates. I think one way to think about this is that old homes tell their own story. You know, some of them have great records and some of them you can research. But as you peel back the layers, they tell you what's gone on in them over time. You guys get that same impression?
Well, the first thing I like to do is go up to the Spencer Archives at KU. And you may not actually find an old picture or old pictures of that home, but you may see that old home in other pictures of other homes. So that's probably the most valuable resource that I've found in this area.
And properties that aren't designated, they're still great resources. The State Historical Society has an incredible inventory that you can find photos of a number of houses that aren't designated. But I think it's sort of a great tool, depending on how far you're going to go with the project to understand where it's been and what's gone on there. Anything to add to that, Billy or Brandon?
My favorite house, I'm going to tell a story about my favorite house I've got. Okay. So I bought a house in Lawrence, Kansas on South Park, and it was condemned, and I bought it from this really nice older couple that had kind of had no business owning rentals at that point in their life. And so I bought it, it had been condemned by the city, you couldn't live in it, but there was this rumor on the street that underneath the steel siding was this super unique tongue and groove, kind of carved to look like bricks. I guess Jefferson's house in Monticello has like a very similar space in the name of what it is. There's an architectural term for it. So we bought this house, and the first thing I did after I closed on it is I drove over there with my hammer and my pry bar, and I started prying off the steel siding because it was all just terrible, pinkish, steel siding, and they replaced a bunch of windows. And so, sure enough, underneath that was this beautiful, like tongue and groove, probably like this thick, and they carved it individually into bricks, which is why I'm saying like the craftsmen of the yesteryear. I mean, back in the day, like they were pros. And so we restored that whole thing, and the guy that works for me, Chris, who's just an all-around great guy, he spent a month and a half, I think, like remaking this trim so that we could take out the old windows and put back in what they originally looked like. And luckily there was an article that somebody in the architecture school had written in like the 70s before they covered it all up with steel siding about the siding was there, and they had pictures that showed what the front windows were supposed to look like before they put in this big, huge slider. And it easily, we say, the front door was there. Unfortunately, like the front door and the staircase and this exterior siding was about all that was left of this house after it had been, lived in and condemned, and so we were able to save those three items, and it easily is my favorite house that we've done because it was just such a dramatic transformation, and I feel like we were able to. I think it's probably the only example in Lawrence of that particular type of siding. Like I have not found another one in Lawrence that has that carved kind of stone look. And so I don't know that I've gone to Spencer Museum on a particular project to like research it ahead of time. Most of the time we're in the house and we're learning about the house as because the stuff I do is, some of the houses we've done have been just, ramshackle, condemned, you couldn't live in them. And so as you bring that house back to life, and then as the neighborhood realizes like what's happening, and you pull all that siding off, and it looks like a tornado hit it, and then it comes back and it's this beautiful house, and it's, people are like, what? Well, where does this house come from? And so that's kind of what my approach to it.
Certainly, and obviously on historic preservation projects, it's sort of the first step, right, to learn as much as you can about it. But I think it's part of my approach whenever I have a new project is to sort of take inventory of what we know, see what we can learn. I think we're out of time. This group will be around for a little bit in the foyer, I imagine, if you'd like to pick up a card or visit with them. I'm sure they'd be glad to talk with you. But I want to thank our panelists, I want to thank the Preservation Alliance and the Heritage Council for allowing us to be here. Thank you all for your time.
So we're going to go into our lunch break. Let me see if Caitlin has anything to add to that.
We'll be back here at 1:45. Be sure to check out Carl Randberg and the oral histories over at the Lawrence Art Center on your lunch break.
Lumberyard Arts. He's got it on your lunch break. We'll see you all at 1:45.